On April 2, 2005, the world did not simply receive news from Rome, it entered a vigil. For days, millions had been watching the windows of the Apostolic Palace, waiting for updates, reading every gesture, every medical bulletin, every whispered sign that the end might be close. Then the announcement came: Pope John Paul II was dead. In St. Peter's Square, the crowd did not erupt. It sank. Candles flickered in the dark as prayers turned into mourning. Bells rang across Rome, but the silence between them felt even louder, because this was not only the death of a pope, it was the death of a man whose face had become one of the most recognized moral symbols on earth. What made the moment so overwhelming was scale. He was not merely the leader of the Catholic Church. He was a figure who had moved through history in public, through communism, war, terrorism, political transformation, youth culture, media expansion, and the long spectacle of physical decline. Presidents knew him, pilgrims followed him. Crowds from Africa to Latin America, from Eastern Europe to Asia, had seen him not as a distant cleric, but as a living presence. So when the Vatican confirmed his death, the reaction was global and immediate. Television networks remained locked on Rome. Heads of state issued statements. Churches filled. In Poland, his homeland, grief felt deeply personal. In the square, young people cried openly, some holding flags, some kneeling, some simply staring upward as if they could not imagine the window ever staying dark again. But that is where the story truly begins, not with doctrine, ceremony, or even power, but with a question. How does one man become so spiritually and historically immense that the whole world seems to pause just to watch him die? How does a boy born as Karol Wojtyła in Poland rise from private grief and war-torn youth to become a figure capable of speaking across continents, ideologies, and generations? To understand why the Vatican fell silent that night, we have to go back before the white robes, before St. Peter's, before the papacy itself, back to a childhood shaped by loss, faith, and a Europe already preparing to break.
Before he became Pope John Paul II, before the white robes and the vast crowds, he was Karol Wojtyła, a boy born in 1920 in the small Polish town of Wadowice. His early life was marked less by power than by quiet routines: school, church, books, prayer, and family. But even in those early years, loss entered quickly. His mother died when he was still a child. Later, his older brother also died, leaving Karol's world increasingly narrow and intimate. What remained at the center of that shrinking world was his father, a disciplined former army officer whose quiet faith and personal austerity shaped the boy profoundly. In that household, religion was not performance. It was endurance. It was structure in the face of grief. Long before Karol understood history, he was already learning how suffering could deepen a person instead of destroying him. As he grew older, Karol developed into something more complex than the future world would later imagine. He was devout, yes, but he was also intellectual, athletic, and artistically alive. He loved literature, language, philosophy, and especially theater. Friends remembered him as serious but warm, inward but not cold. He studied hard, acted in school productions, and seemed drawn to both words and silence. This matters because the young Karol was not shaped by religion alone. He was shaped by culture, by Polish identity, by performance, by the emotional power of language. These influences would later define how he spoke to crowds across continents. He would not become a pope who only issued declarations. He would become a pope who understood drama, image, symbol, and human vulnerability. Then history closed in. When Nazi Germany occupied Poland, Karol's youth was violently interrupted. Universities were shut down, public life was crushed. Polish culture itself became something dangerous to protect. He worked in a quarry and later in a chemical factory, hard labor that shielded him from deportation while exposing him daily to war's brutality. During this time, he also became involved in underground cultural and spiritual life, participating in clandestine theater and deepening his religious vocation in secret. These were not ordinary years of formation. They were years in which survival, faith, intellect, and national identity fused together under occupation. By the time Karol chose the path toward the priesthood, the choice was no longer simply personal. It was existential. He had seen enough loss to know that faith, for him, would never be abstract. It would be a way of standing inside history without surrendering to it. The war did not simply surround Karol Wojtyła. It entered every layer of his life and forced every belief to prove itself. Under Nazi occupation, Poland was not only conquered, It was systematically stripped of its intellectual, cultural, and spiritual life. Priests were watched, professors disappeared, public institutions were dismantled, and fear became ordinary. For Karol, this was the environment in which adulthood arrived. He worked exhausting labor jobs by day, moved through a city under constant threat, and watched his country reduced to silence by force. Yet what makes this chapter so important is that he did not respond by becoming smaller. He moved inward and upward at the same time. If war was trying to break the soul of Poland, he began to understand that preserving the soul was itself a form of resistance. That is why faith in Karol's life stopped being inherited religion and became chosen conviction. During the occupation, he became involved in underground theater, an artistic act that was also a patriotic one, because preserving Polish language and culture had become dangerous. At the same time, he entered the secret seminary organized in defiance of Nazi rule. These two paths, culture and faith, did not compete inside him. They fused. He was learning that words could protect memory and belief could protect identity. This is the deeper reason his future presence would feel so unusual to the world. He was not shaped by comfort, bureaucracy, or clerical ambition. He was shaped by survival under systems that wanted both the body and the spirit to submit. By the end of the war, his priestly vocation was no longer a private calling. It had become a response to history. But the end of Nazi occupation did not bring simple freedom. Poland soon fell under communist control, and a different form of pressure began. The language changed, the ideology changed, but once again the state tried to define how much space religion, conscience, and human dignity would be allowed to occupy. Karol rose through the church during this era not because he was sheltered from conflict, but because he had already been trained by one regime of oppression to recognize another. As priest, bishop, and later archbishop, he developed a style of leadership rooted not in spectacle, but in firmness. He understood power because he had lived beneath it. He understood fear because he had outlasted it. This is what made him different from many churchmen of his generation. He was not merely preserving tradition, he was preparing for confrontation. By the time the world would one day see him step onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, the core of that future pope had already been forged. In quarry dust, underground prayer, occupied streets, and a homeland that taught him faith could be both refuge and rebellion. When the white smoke rose in October 1978 and the name Karol Wojtyła was announced to the world, history shifted in an instant. For the first time in more than 4 centuries, the Roman Catholic Church had chosen a non-Italian pope. He took the name John Paul II, and from the very beginning, it was clear he would not be a quiet transitional figure. He stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's, not as a distant administrator, but as a man already shaped by war, occupation, and ideological struggle. He understood how power worked, how fear operated, and how symbols could move people faster than policy ever could. That mattered, because the late 20th century was not only a religious era, it was a geopolitical battlefield, and John Paul II entered it with unusual force. He changed the image of the papacy by refusing to let it remain still. He traveled constantly, visiting nations across Europe, Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, turning the Pope from a figure seen mostly in Rome into a truly global presence. Crowds did not gather around him only because of doctrine. They gathered because he projected something rare: moral seriousness without coldness, authority without stiffness, spiritual conviction without passivity. In places suffering from dictatorship, poverty, or repression, his presence often felt larger than ceremonial religion. He spoke in the language of dignity, human worth, and freedom of conscience. For millions of Catholics, he became a shepherd. For millions of non-Catholics, he became one of the most recognizable moral voices on earth. The Church had always been global in structure. Under John Paul II, it became global in image and movement. Nowhere was that influence more politically explosive than in Eastern Europe. As a Polish pope, he carried enormous symbolic power in a region still trapped behind communist systems. His 1979 visit to Poland did not overthrow a regime by itself, but it changed the psychological landscape. It reminded millions of people that identity, faith, and national memory could survive state pressure. His presence fed courage into a society already trembling with suppressed resistance. In the years that followed, many observers would connect his moral influence to the weakening of communist legitimacy in Poland and beyond. This did not make him a conventional politician. It made him something harder to measure, a spiritual figure with real historical force. By the 1980s and 1990s, John Paul II was no longer merely the head of the Catholic Church. He had become one of the defining public figures of the century, a man whose voice could reach governments, movements, and ordinary believers alike. But to carry that much symbolic power across that many years comes with a cost. And soon, the body itself would begin to reveal what history had been asking of him. On May 13, 1981, St. Peter's Square was alive with the familiar rhythm of a papal audience, pilgrims waving, cameras flashing, children lifted into the air for a blessing. Then the gunshots came. Pope John Paul II collapsed inside the open vehicle as panic tore through the square. In seconds, the image of an untouchable spiritual leader was replaced by something brutally human. A wounded body, bleeding in public, carried toward an ambulance while the world watched in horror. The assassination attempt shocked not only Catholics, but governments, journalists, and ordinary observers across the globe. A pope had always symbolized continuity, distance, and ritual. Now the body of that symbol had been pierced in broad daylight. John Paul II survived, but survival itself became part of his legend. Even more striking was what followed. He later visited his would-be assassin in prison and forgave him, transforming a moment of violence into one of the most enduring images of mercy in modern religious history. But the bullet was only the beginning of the body's long surrender. As the years passed, John Paul II continued to travel, speak, and appear before enormous crowds. Yet the signs of physical weakening became harder to ignore. Surgeries, pain, and the visible effects of Parkinson's disease slowly altered the man who had once moved across the world with athletic confidence. His hands shook. His posture changed. His voice, once firm and resonant, became fragile and at times difficult to understand. In another public figure, such decline might have been hidden. In his case, it unfolded before the entire planet. Millions watched him age, slow down, and suffer in real time. That visibility became one of the defining features of his later papacy. And yet he did not step away. That decision is central to understanding his final years. John Paul II seemed to believe that weakness, too, could speak. He had spent much of his life confronting systems that tried to erase dignity, and now his own body became the site of another confrontation. He would not disappear simply because he could no longer project strength in the old way. Instead, he allowed the world to see frailty without surrendering authority. To some, it was painful to watch. To others, it was one of the most powerful testimonies of his life. The Pope, who had once defied war, ideology, and assassination, was now confronting decay itself in public. And by refusing to hide it, he turned suffering into a final language the whole world could understand. When Pope John Paul II entered the final days of his life, Rome no longer felt like a city. It felt like a vigil. Pilgrims filled St. Peter's Square hour after hour, day after day, praying beneath open sky while candles, songs, and silence merged into one long act of waiting. Giant screens carried every medical update. Windows were watched as if history itself might appear behind the glass. And when the Vatican finally confirmed his death on April 2, 2005, grief did not explode. It deepened. The square became quieter, heavier, more solemn. People cried, knelt, embraced strangers, and kept praying. For many, this was not simply the death of a religious leader. It was the passing of a man whose face had accompanied an entire age. The funeral that followed looked less like a national ceremony than a gathering of the world. Heads of state, royalty, clergy, pilgrims, and ordinary believers stood together in Rome, drawn by the same gravity. Millions watched from afar as the coffin was carried into St. Peter's Square, where history, politics, faith, and personal mourning all converged. What made the moment so powerful was not only the scale, but the recognition that John Paul II had belonged to more than one people. He was Polish and Roman, Catholic and global, intimate and monumental at the same time. The chant that rose from the crowd, "Santo subito," Saint now, revealed how many felt that they were not just burying a pope, but witnessing the elevation of a moral witness. And that is where his legacy settled into permanence. John Paul II would be remembered not only for doctrine or diplomacy, but for endurance. Through war, totalitarianism, bullets, disease, and the long public stripping away of strength. He had shown the world charisma, courage, forgiveness, and finally weakness without shame. In death, the symbolism only intensified. The boy from Wadowitz, who had lost almost everything early in life, had become one of the most globally recognized spiritual figures of the modern era. He did not leave the world quietly. The world gathered to watch a century say goodbye.